My name's Debbie Yang, and I'm the COO at the Chertoff Group. I actually spent a great deal of time working with both the federal government and innovative technology companies, many of which come from Silicon Valley. So I'm very honored to be here among such a fantastic group of individuals. There's really no better panel to talk about security and innovation than the individuals that we have here. We've got Manoj Lalonivas, the CEO at SciPort, Renee Taryn, Deputy Chief of the Cyber Task Force at the NSA, Dr. George Duchak, Director of the Defense Innovation Unit, and Marty Roach, Chief Architect for the Security Business Group at Cisco. What I'd like to do today is frame our discussion around certain themes with security and innovation as the centerpiece. Themes like the new ways in which government and industry are working together, the differences in the way small and large companies innovate, new threats that are out there, perspectives on how security is being better incorporated into innovation these days. But before we go any further, I'd like to give our panelists a chance to briefly introduce themselves. Manoj, I'll start with you.
My name is Manoj Lalonivas, President and CEO of SciPort. At SciPort, we protect enterprises from the next generation of advanced threats. So by offering a single pane of glass view for threats coming from your perimeter as well as lateral, we are able to quickly identify the breaches as well as reduce the time to mitigation of the breaches. So that's what we do as a company. Prior to SciPort, I was the Executive Vice President General Manager at Juniper Networks, and prior to that at Cisco Systems. So about 25 years in the Valley, worked with the various different government agencies in the past. And incidentally, the company I work for first is the company which Marty on the right is working for right now.
Renee?
My name is Renee Taryn. I'm the Deputy Chief of the NSA Cyber Task Force. The NSA has two main missions. We focus on information assurance, which is our cybersecurity focused organizations, and we have our Signals Intelligence Directorate focusing on foreign intelligence. The NSA Cyber Task Force, we look at doing cyber integration across NSA, and we focus on doing a lot of outward engagements with our government partners and industry and academia, and working on advancing the cyber status quo.
George Duchak. I'm Director of the Secretary of Defense's startup, DIUx, out in Silicon Valley. So I guess I could say I work for a large nonprofit with a several trillion in market cap right now. So, before that, I was at Rome Labs as Director of Rome Labs. Before that, private industry, several startups. And before that, DARPA, and before that, active duty Navy.
So I'm Marty Roach. I'm the Chief Architect at Cisco in the Security Business Group. My responsibilities primarily revolve around product and technology strategy for security solutions at Cisco, as well as essentially riding herd over the global architecture for our security offerings that we have. Prior to Cisco, I was the founder and usually Chief Technology Officer and occasionally CEO at SourceFire. SourceFire was a company that was started up the road in Central Maryland around the Snort open source intrusion detection prevention system, of which I was the original author. And basically, we started innovating on business models, actually, not on technology, by building a value-added technology platform around an open source core, and then built a variety of technologies after that business model started to prove itself out, innovating in the security space to gain differentiation versus our competitors. From there, we were acquired by Cisco 2 years ago, and since then I've been doing this. Prior to that, I worked in government contracting and worked for various agencies where I got into the game of cybersecurity originally.
George, I'd like to start with you because DIUx is probably the least well-known entity here. The initiative started in August 2015. It's Secretary Ash Carter's startup in the Valley. How do you hope to transform the way DoD does business in Silicon Valley?
Yeah, well, you're right. He announced the idea in April, and we finally stood up in the end of August, so we've been operating for about 2 months now. And we have 3 lines of effort. One is to establish, repair, or maintain relationships with Valley companies. And when I say valley, I got to be a little bit careful there because we're located in Silicon Valley, but we're open to innovation from anywhere in the country. So first line of effort is all about relationships because you can't do anything else unless you have a relationship. The second is to be the tech scout for new and emerging technologies to help solve some of the vexing problems that DoD is facing. And the last one is to be the DoD hub in the Valley. And I think that's a result of a lot of U.S. government fatigue. Valley companies suffer from. Every SES in Washington has to do their annual or semi-annual trek out to the Valley and get the brief from the Googles, the Facebooks, the Ubers, et cetera. And so I remember going out there. I did the same thing when I was director of Rome Labs. And I'd say, I'm from the government, and they would say, which government? Department of Defense, and which Department of Defense? And he'd say, the Air Force, and they say, which Air Force? So they're just inundated by visitors from the government. So trying to focus some of the effort out there with DIUx as being the hub is the third line of effort. And that is much like an embassy model that we are using, where DIUx is the embassy in a foreign land. And for DoD, Silicon Valley is truly a foreign land. The cultures couldn't be more different. And so that's pretty much the way our model functions.
So it sounds like a company like SciPort is the type of innovative company that you all are looking to work with. But Manoj, SciPort is 3 years old. And if you want to do business at DoD, you need to go commit significant resources, getting certifications like FIPS and common criteria, which can take up to 2 years to get. Why would you choose to invest in doing business with defense or the federal government generally?
Very good question. As a CEO, definitely there's an aspect of doing what is right for the industry as well as making money for the company, right? Both parts are there. So if you look at the 3-year-old company we are, given the challenges you mentioned specifically to get into the different agencies in terms of compliance procedures, certifications, typically startups in the Silicon Valley do not go into the federal area right in the beginning, right? We start with the commercial area like we did, technology, financial companies, healthcare, and build up a good business before starting to invest in the federal space. That's a typical model in Silicon Valley because things are moving so fast and you want to build up the business as quickly as possible, so you don't have the time to wait for the year of certification or two. So this is one thing I would ask people in the different department agencies and whatnot. If you look at the bad actors, they don't have any of these restrictions, right? They have unparalleled access to compute, unparalleled access to storage. The cost of a million instruction per second right now is a penny. It used to be tens of millions of dollars 10 years ago. It is a penny now. And if you look at storage, your smartphone can carry up to a terabyte right now. So given that the bad actors have this unfair advantage where they can do anything quickly, but I think we are putting a lot of unnecessary obstacles to get to innovation quickly. And I think this is one thing which would be great as part of your initiative, George. This could be something you can help with, where you should encourage the Valley companies as they are starting itself, the first 6 months itself, to engage with government agencies and others, and reduce the barrier to entry, right? Why make the barrier to entry so high for the good guys, where the barrier to entry for the bad guys is so low, right? So that is the way we need to think. To me, the biggest risk is not taking a risk. And I think every commercial organization, especially in the Valley, is taking that step of taking that risk and creating this amazing amount of companies in the Valley, which is changing the game. I think it's time for every other function in the country, in the true interests of the spirit of the country, also to take a little bit of risk. That's what I would say. But having said that, to your specific question, we are now investing into the different certifications. So it's a great opportunity for us to expand to the government agencies, both in the U.S. as well as outside. Mm-hmm. And we are providing a solution which would be great for the government agencies to adopt. And now we're going through the process.
Excellent. Are you? What are things that DIUx is helping to break down barriers for companies like SciPort?
Yeah, I resonate with this point about risk. You couldn't have two different cultures in terms of risk tolerance. In the Valley, you learn by failing. You keep pivoting, you find out what's the right tech, what's the right application, what's the right model. In DoD, we seem to study things forever and want you try to get to that state of no risk, which is an impossible dream. So, in terms of breaking down barriers for startups, there are two things that we kind of focus on. The very early stage is where we could work with a small startup that's maybe pre-seed, pre-round A, that would be interested in doing a demo to show us some of the capability. That way DoD gets some insight into the emerging technology. They get funded to do something that's non-dilutive because DoD is not an investor, we're a buyer. Or companies that are much more mature that DoD has traditionally not worked with. At the other end, they're C, D, E round funded companies, so they're mature. They're not really looking for DoD business, but in this climate of growth, DoD is just another path to growth for them as well.
Before we move off of some of the challenges with working with government, I just want to bring up one other challenge, which maybe Marty or Manoj could speak to, because I know in a lot of R&D efforts for innovative technologies, you employ foreign nationals. And in fact, there are many great technologies coming out of foreign countries. This is more of a question for George and Renee. I know you might be limited in being able to answer this question, but how is the government leveraging some of the technologies that have a foreign footprint?
Okay, so the motivation for DIUx, Secretary Carter talks often about drilling holes in the walls that divide industries, that separate industry, academia, and the government. He could also say there's a wall between U.S. and foreign governments as well. And the U.S. no longer has dominion over the best and brightest. And this is a conversation that we don't have an answer to right now in terms of how to deal with foreign nationals and foreign ownership of corporations with great ideas that we'd like to incorporate. So I wish I had an answer, but that's a debate that's worth talking about.
So there are things we as companies in Silicon Valley can do, and Marty can also talk a lot about it. The software industry has changed drastically over the last 5 to 10 years. So we have the ability to build things in a very modular fashion, very API-driven fashion, so we can actually create layers of the onion, so as to call it, right? So this allows us to kind of separate boundaries between module A, which is super critical and should be tight, module B less tight, and so on. So this kind of methodology allows us to create different capabilities, which allows to meet some of the restrictions which the government has in terms of what technologies can come from outside or what people can work on some of the outside technologies. So we have ways to circumvent some of these things to specifically meet the requirements, specifically for separation of things which are developed by foreign nationals versus U.S. nationals.
Mm-hmm. Marty, you're at Cisco right now, so there are many more resources that are available to you, and so you probably don't have many of the similar challenges that a smaller company might have. But one challenge that one might say a larger company like Cisco has is how to stay nimble and keep up with the rapid pace of change. And you're in a unique position because you started Snort as open source. It was productized as SourceFire, and now you're at Cisco. What's your perspective on the challenge of keeping up with innovation at a larger company?
That's actually kind of one of my chief concerns that I have working at Cisco is how do we keep ourselves relevant in this very rapidly evolving security sector and not lock ourselves into the decisions that we make to drive our technologies forward. And this is one of the chief things I've been working on during my time there is making sure that we're set up so that we have a lot of flexibility across our platforms. And we've done a variety of things to be able to drive that, from going to a mostly software-driven set of security offerings so that we can innovate at the pace of software, to building interoperability layers, or at least designing interoperability layers to be built right now, because these things are in process, that establish integration and interoperability between our technologies, of which we have many, in which we continue to acquire new companies with new innovation, and do so in a manner where they're very loosely coupled, so that information sharing happens in ways that are useful and relevant, but we aren't stuck into an architecture where if you don't have all the pieces of the puzzle, it just doesn't work. So it's kind of a delicate balance that we're working on at Cisco today to do these things. We have a lot of big mainline technologies, our firewall and NGFW business and our IPS business, and some of these other business sectors, which are quite large in the security space, that are kind of cornerstones of what we're building towards, but building kind of the layer on top of it to enable this interoperability, to enable this integration in a way that gives us a lot of optionality and a lot of flexibility to continue to bring in innovative pieces, because Cisco, we've spent about $4 billion acquiring companies in the last 2.5 years, including mine, and it is very apparent that we're going to keep going, and we need to have an architecture that anticipates that. I can't go buy another company and give a customer another UI, another management platform, another reporting system to figure out, if they want to buy my portfolio. I can't, bring in a portfolio that's got 10 different management platforms and 10 different languages for describing what bad looks like. We have to bring these things together, and we're building an architecture that allows us to maintain that flexibility and drive innovation into our platform, our overarching suite that we're putting together.
So you talked about acquisition. It was just recently announced that Cisco bought LandCope and OpenDNS. Congratulations. And even at SourceFire, you acquired ClamAV and Immunet. How do you decide to build or buy? And after you buy a company, how do you integrate them into a larger entity like Cisco without degrading the culture of innovation?
That's a very long answer. When I look at acquisitions and when I think about technologies, usually what drives an acquisition is we decide we need to move in a direction quickly where we don't have the opportunity to drive innovation internally, or it's a technology footprint that's foreign to what we've done in the past. So we need to get that technology footprint in-house and then build it into the rest of the offering. I think one of the examples that I'm probably happiest with of how it worked out was the Immunet acquisition that we did at SourceFire back at the end of 2010. Immunet was a consumer cloud-based anti-malware platform using some new approaches to doing anti-malware. And when we brought them in, SourceFire was a network security company that primarily focused on the enterprise, and we went out and bought a consumer cloud play. So the analyst community was like, what? And what I saw in Immunet was not what they were doing, but what you could do with that. So as they came on board, we had great cultural fit right away. There were a lot of established relationships, interpersonal relationships between the companies long before the deal happened, which helped smooth out the cultural integration. The cultures were already very close. But at a component level, a software component level, a systems component level, what we decided to do to bring these things together, to marry up endpoint and network, and get them interoperating in ways that were meaningful to deal with advanced malware and things like that. This was a pretty radical departure, and we didn't get a whole lot of encouraging response from the analysts, neither the Wall Street nor the industry analyst community. They were like, do you guys even have any idea what you're doing? And we executed on that, and we've had a great outcome. And now the Immunet has turned into AMP, which is across all of our platforms at Cisco, and it's a very powerful set of capabilities that is doing very well in the market. So it's been a total home run. As I look at companies, I am part of the team at Cisco who looks at M&A. I certainly don't drive it, but I look at it, I think about it, how it's going to work in the architecture, the overall architecture. I do look at it in terms of what is this, but what could you do with this from where it is today? What else can it do? Where else can it be? And I think it's important if you're going to be a company that grows by acquisition, that drives these acquisitions, that you have that viewpoint. It can't just be, I need to go out and tactically buy up this technology because I'm getting outmaneuvered in some area of the market. It is, what does this technology give me today, and what is this technology going to allow me to do 2 years, 5 years from now? And that's the way that we've been driving. And there's a very receptive audience at Cisco for thinking that way.
I have a perspective, being on both sides of the equation, kind of like Marty. If you look at the large companies, there are two problems, right? One is, the problem which Marty addressed, which is the integration of various diverse technologies into a platform so the customers can have a holistic view of things. The second problem is that large companies, once they have these assets, tend to get more siloed, which is basically, want to keep things vertically integrated, right? So this is where, I would actually turn the questions to the folks in the middle of the panel, our customers, potential customers, that, how does the customer community make sure that the large vendors doesn't silo and create vertically oriented things, while to generate innovation, you need the horizontal innovation across the board, right? Which is where, if you look at every other industry other than security, it's been the thesis, right? Whether, the next generation of Blockbuster wasn't Hollywood Video, it's Netflix, right? Uber on, versus the taxis, the traditional way. So software has been eating the world, as Mark Andreessen eloquently put. But security, in many ways, is siloed more and more rather than being open and working with each other. So, the world is moving towards APIs in every other industry, right? Networking, software, networking industry, storage industry, everywhere. But security has still been a little parochial and a little siloed in many ways, because the moment the acquisition happens to the big company wants to keep it as a single piece of silo and not share with the others, right? And security, if anything, is the place where you need to share information. The good guys need to share information. So the tools are there, the APIs are there. Automation has never been in such a place as it is, ever in the history of mankind. So how can we leverage API automation and sharing of information and encourage those companies which allow that new order to happen in security? And how do you look at those things? I'll ask the question to the folks in the middle of the panel.
Well, I'm a little bit more optimistic because I'm seeing a lot more partnerships being developed in key alliances, especially in the form of developing, automation. From a standpoint of cybersecurity, we need the people, processes, and technology, but we need to leverage the automation, because at the end of the day, that's the only thing that's going to scale. Because the number of cyber attacks are increasing, their sophistication is increasing. And because of cyber relevant time, if we can leverage automation and having our security components work together, it's taking the advantage away from the adversary and bringing it back to the cyber defenders. So from our perspective, we're seeing a lot of things coming out into the market from an innovation perspective. For example, secure orchestration, working to have our security components working together as a team to gain those efficiencies at speed and scale in cybersecurity. So I'm a little bit more optimistic that some of those key alliances are starting to be establishing with companies for the greater good of the whole.
It's really heartening to see that, actually. George, your perspective on what you're trying to do to enable this innovation to happen in a more groundswell sort of way.
I think you're seeing a shift in at least DoD software architectures. 20 years ago, I remember hearing the words open, scalable, modular, and they were just words. Now you're actually starting to see it, where DoD is actually taking the architectures, owning the reference architecture and the platform, and then competition occurs at the module level at the different apps. The incentive in the past was for a prime to own, the whole thing, this 20 million source lines of code, monolithic, that anytime you change anything, you had to go back to a prime for the next X number of years, 20 years or whatever. Since DoD has a pathology of keeping systems around forever, I think that's that industrial age model. Airplanes and aircraft carriers got to live for 50 years, and they think software does too. So, they haven't grokked that you could recapitalize much more quickly there. But that being said, the shift in the architectures that you're starting to see, I think is going to enable us.
With so many companies out there and so much competition, there are clearly there's a lot of innovation coming out of Silicon Valley and out of other tech hubs across the country. How do you distinguish them and identify the companies that are going to best meet the needs of the government?
Well, some of the things that we're doing are plug fest, hackathons, things like that. That essentially try before you buy. I think everybody who's been on the government side, on either the DoD or Intel side, has had the trust me, you're going to love it, and they buy something without actually using it first. So I think just those sorts of things are going to be an enabler.
Right. From NSA's perspective, we have an organization called the NSA Commercial Solution Centers that does a lot of outward reach into the private sector, understanding what capabilities and technologies are coming onto the market, and understanding what some of our requirements are. So there's a lot of that exchange going on. And in addition, I think we're also looking to leverage more pilots so that we can establish what are some of those best of breed capabilities out there to advance our missions.
Let's move the conversation towards threat and what we're seeing out there. There seems to be this constant cat and mouse game between security and innovation. As we innovate, the bad guys innovate around us and find a way in. And security is seemingly always trying to play catch up. Can we ever get out in front of this cycle?
I mean, again, if you look at the last, if you look 5 years before, things were in silos in many ways, right? It was not a truly connected world across the entire globe. So it was, okay to think parochially of security a little bit afterwards, because efficiency always trumped security in those days. But now it's a truly connected world. And, other day somebody was talking about Internet of Things and about 100 billion devices. But I was thinking it's not really Internet of Things anymore, right? It's Internet of everything. So, everything is connected, right, from your car to your smartphone to everything, right? So in this new world, if you're plugging into the matrix, so as to speak, which is the internet, you better be prepared when you plug in, right? So you got to think of security right up front. What's the privileges, what is the partitions, what's the posture, and what is the plan B and plan C? If anyway, something is, breached or something happens, how do you prepare for plan B and plan C? So you need to have that posture much more now than it was ever before in the industry, in the world. Because previously you had the benefit of silos or boundaries. Now there is no boundary. And the equivalent parallel on the IT world is that if you look at the business world, once upon a time, there was a clear perimeter in the enterprise. So it was great to have the firewalls and the secure web gateways and the IPS devices to protect your perimeter. But the perimeter is no longer relevant. Almost 70% of the Fortune 500 is completely embraced BYOD, bring your own device. 700 cloud applications on the average in a Fortune 500 enterprise. What this tells you is that cloud, mobility, and of course the other trends like big data and others have completely changed that perimeter. It's almost vanished. So you got to think of this new world in a fundamentally different way than what's been thought about in the last 2 decades. It was Albert Einstein who eloquently put again, right? What's the point of doing the same thing again and again and expecting different results? You're not going to get different results. It's insanity. So in this new world, you got to think about things in a fundamentally different way, where you think about context. What is the context? What is the risk in your environment? What are the solutions which can really allow you to quickly hone into that risk in the environment and then mitigate it? And again, like Renee said, automation, APIs. All of those are going to be where it is. So the threat landscape has changed fundamentally, where the bad guys have a significant advantage. They have everything. They share with each other. $150 for getting the Stuxnet variations to play with different places. Just $150. It's available on the blacknet, right? So that is one side of the equation. On the other side of the equation, we are still struggling with the vanishing perimeter, and we're still looking at the traditional approach. So we got to go more modern, more API, more innovative, as well as more driven towards automation.
Do you think current security companies understand this changing threat environment?
Do I think companies understand the changing threat environment? I think they're, people are becoming dimly aware. You see the lights coming on in a lot of places these days of the kind of the grade and perniciousness of the threat that they face. I'm actually still pretty dubious on getting out in front of kind of the current innovation pace of the bad guys these days. I think some good steps have been taken with some of these walled garden models like Apple's been able to do on the iPad. and iPhone, where they can essentially have key-based access to the platforms that they can revoke. Of course, there are still vulnerabilities in the platforms and things like that, but that gives you a much more controlled execution environment, which is where, it seems to me that we need to start thinking about driving towards that, because, if you look at the x86 platform, just fundamentally from a can I secure this platform standpoint, today the answer is pretty much no, you can't. And this is what most people are operating on, and this is where most computing happens these days. So, there's a lot of work that needs to happen at the fundamental platform level, and knowing that work is, slowly coming about and things like that gives me hope, but at the same time, with the Internet of Things coming up and, 50 billion internet-connected cat boxes and light bulbs out there, it's going to be a while before I think people can really feel, deeply secure. I see some of the things that are going on now with connected cars and things like that. And it's Pandora's box, and we're going to be dealing with the fallout from this drive to innovation through these industries that want to bring people great new capabilities, great new features, but without necessarily thinking about the risks that are being incurred by these innovations. So it's a very, very complex space. I think that getting ahead of the attackers and staying ahead of them across all these platforms that we're introducing anytime soon is going to be real tricky.
George, Renee?
Right, so I want to follow on to some of the comments that our industry partners have made, and especially when we're talking about how we characterize risk. When we look at risk, we look at what are the vulnerabilities, the threats, and the consequences that we face. And a lot of times, we address risk as, what's the threat? And that's being based upon, understanding who your adversaries are and what are their TTPs that you're trying to mitigate against. But what it doesn't take into account is what about the adversaries that we don't know about? So I think when we start talking about risk, we need to start looking about data-driven repeatable models and how we characterize risk that focus on the consequence piece. What are the consequences that we are trying to avoid happening within our networks? And going back to the cat and mouse question, how do we get ahead of our adversary? Obviously, we've talked about leveraging automation. But another thing I think we need to do is that we're getting good at sharing information, the threats and indicators at cyber relevant time. I think the next phase we need to start focusing on is how can we start sharing automated courses of action so that we're getting to an environment where we're more proactive versus reactive. So what you're seeing on one enclave, one network, if you're taking specific courses of actions, how can we share that across our enterprises so that, again, you can take mitigation steps before those cyber attacks have an impact on you. And the next thing I would say from getting ahead of the adversary is, we spent a lot of times investing in hardening and defending our network, now leveraging automation to make that happen. And I think the next phase we need to start looking at is leveraging automation to make our networks more resilient and being able to regenerate. We need to get left of boom, as what we like to say, as much as possible. Recognizing that if we can be more proactive and make mitigations happen on our networks so that we can prevent or minimize the impact on our networks, but recognize that when boom does happen, and it's inevitably it's going to happen, we need to get our networks back to a secure, trustable state as quickly as possible. And I think if we can start leveraging automation and innovation to make those capabilities come to fruition, then I think at the end of the day, I think we're going to be changing the game for the adversary, where we're being more proactive versus reacting to their behaviors. Mm-hmm.
So in terms of being more proactive, we often hear that security is bolted onto technologies after the fact. Why do you think more emphasis isn't placed on designing securely earlier on in the process? So
I think in the past, I think the focus was on, developing technologies to gain efficiencies. In today's environment, that's no longer a choice we should be making, whether we do something more efficient or securely. We have to do both. Similarly, if we're going to do cybersecurity at speed and scale, we need to address the privacy issue at speed and scale as well. I think from an example I mentioned earlier about security, secure orchestration that we're seeing come into the marketplace, that's a good example where we are being able to do both, where we're, increasing the security postures of our networks, but also being more efficient in how we do it.
The world has changed definitely because the stakes are much higher now, and I think you see a lot larger focus on security right in the beginning in institutions across the government as well as various different Fortune 1000 organizations. Previously, like Renee said, efficiency always trumps security, right? So there was no CEO who was talking about security. Target changed all of that, right? Self-preservation is a great instinct. So just like efficiency and making the bottom line was a good bottom line and top line was the first priority for a CEO of a commercial company. Now security is becoming an interesting business enabler because without security, without the right risk posture, the CEO and the board are also exposed. So that was a big shift which happened, as part of that, bad event which happened at Target. So the priority is, the levels of, awareness has gone up significantly, which is a wonderful thing for security, number one. Number two, like I said earlier, it's truly connected across the world. So in this scenario where, a particular nation state can take advantage of, what's happening in the energy sector here, or a certain, Russian Federation hacker can take advantage of, some of the important customer data in a financial organization so easily, the stakes are again higher. So now you cannot wait for that, security as an afterthought anymore. You got to get ahead of it, both in terms of your posture, with the solutions you have, and also with the plan B and plan C, like Renee was talking about, where you can quickly get to a known state of goodness when something happens. How quickly you can get there. So that's what my perspective is.
So there are clearly some good trends, good security trends going on. There's increased awareness. People are, companies are partnering more openly with each other. There's more information sharing. What other good security trends are you seeing out there, and what would you like to see more of? Maybe Marty, we can start with you.
Sure. Well, I think one of the things that I've been seeing is you've got some of the major platform vendors who are paying attention to security in kind of fundamental ways. Apple is a great example of this. Microsoft has become a much better example of this over the years, where you've got a walled garden model built onto the platform. You've got controlled execution of the platforms. Everything's operating on sandboxes, things like that. Those are great steps in the right direction from securing kind of the access platform to whatever cloud service or corporate assets and things like that. So I think we're seeing a lot of progress there, and it's happening slowly. And to your last question, this is something that people want to see, but they don't necessarily. It's not a big decision driving factor when it comes to getting into these platforms originally, right? It's not a huge differentiator, which is why there's not a lot of demand for it from the consumers of these technologies, which is why it tends to be an afterthought. So when you see the big vendors who are out there, like an Apple, like a Microsoft, saying, no, security has fundamental value because it builds trust in the platform itself, it enables us to move more platforms. When you see a Cisco saying, hey, we want to bring all this innovation to the world in terms of video and telecom and networking and things like that, but we need to have an excellent set of security capabilities and excellent security offerings and strategy to bring to these customers so that they have trust in us to build out these capabilities on our platforms. I think that's a change that 20 years ago you didn't really see, and you really do now, where the underpinnings themselves are getting more secure. And now you have innovation happening elsewhere. Internet of Things is a great area of kind of. I've been working in enterprise security for a very long time. We kind of understand the game that we're playing, and the consumer focus and the industry vertical focus of the Internet of Things vendors, I don't think the realization is there. You hear about refrigerators turning into spam bots and things like that. Obviously, the game has not been moved to the consumer side of the equation. So there's work to be done there. But I like what I see happening at the level of the companies that are developing the underpinnings are advancing their game because it's in their best interest to do so.
So there are some positive developments from last year. If you look at Facebook, Google, Netflix, they open sourced a whole bunch of tools which everybody can leverage, right? OS Query, Rapport, Security Monkey. So that's a very promising trend for security, right? Where the large companies or the innovative companies who have spent a lot of energy and time on ways they've been thwarting some of this stuff, they want to put in the open so that other people can use it. So other people who don't have the same kind of resources can use it. So that's a great trend, and we should encourage that, number one. Number two, in terms of innovation, I think, since the world is, truly flat with so much data, zettabytes of data being generated, it's very tough to have, one view of the world anymore, right? You got to have some ways to leverage, machine learning, AI, automation in this big way to find what is relevant for your enterprise and your organization. So, leveraging companies who are focused on, some of these advanced state-of-the-art techniques, as well as API and automation is probably more needed in this world if you want to quickly stay ahead of the guys who are attacking you. So that's number two. And number three is that there is a huge contribution every organization, including the government, can make, which is basically encourage more of the sharing between companies, right? We are all here to make money, also there for the greater good, right? So how can we get companies to work together more well through APIs? Encourage companies or work with companies who do more of that, and who do not work with companies who do not do that, right? That's one way you can clearly set the tone from a government posture, what you want to do for the world. So those are some of the things I can think about going forward.
Yeah, and I agree with Manoj on a lot of his points. I also think from the government standpoint, you're going to see more of a drive and push to have capabilities work together because we don't have the resources to revamp our infrastructure every time the new latest and greatest product comes on the market. We need to have those products working together collectively. So I think you'll see more of that as of a push. And I think that information sharing piece, I think that's key. We need that more bidirectional information sharing between government and industry, including academia, and that same sharing going on within industry as well.
George, and we only have 1 more minute left or so before we'll move to the audience questions, but looking 2 to 3 years ahead, what will innovation mean in cybersecurity? Where do you see the sources of innovation changing?
I'm sorry, where
the sources of innovation changing?
In cybersecurity in particular?
Or in security?
I don't think it's going to be largely different than it is now. So.
I think it's going to be, we're going to be tackling more problems from the standpoint of, again, in 2 to 3 years, we got to work on that, resiliency, regeneration piece. How do we do information sharing, courses of action? So, but I think, again, we're going to need to leverage the innovation that's happening within industry, academia, and the government perspective.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so we have about 10 minutes to do questions. The lady in the back.
My name is Ann Lilena. I'm with Leapfrog Solutions. May I have the panel's thoughts and comments on active defense on the part of the private sector?
So when you say active defense, do you mean like hacking back, that kind of capability?
Not necessarily limited to hacking back, because there's a whole panoply. So if you want to just take a few, you just want to comment on a few different aspects of it, that's fine too.
I think,
well, that's,
go ahead.
Okay. I think that the typical enterprise has a difficult enough time with securing their own premise, much less getting attribution down to the level of being able to do active interdiction of an external attacker very effectively or capably. It's kind of the sardonic way I put it is that if we let people start doing this, you're going to end up with a lot of dentist's office getting blown off the internet pretty quickly from people going out and taking matters into their own hands. I think there are active measures that you can take where you have cooperation between interoperability partners. For example, active measures where I'm able to codify an attacker or describe an attacker capably enough to be able to inform my upstream providers of what the characteristics of this attacker look like so that they can take action at their level to clamp down on an attacker that's coming in. Also to drive response through, through official channels. But active measures for reaching out and going after an attacker, I think, are very difficult to pull off for most organizations.
I agree with Marty 100% here, right? Attribution was in vogue maybe a few years ago, but no longer in vogue. Because it's like whack-a-mole, right? If you spend more time on that particular mole, there's 1,000 other moles appearing there, right? So you need to focus on, instead of attribution, you need to focus on what are the patterns which is emerging from these new kind of threat actors, and how do you extrapolate from those patterns to prevent attacks from new patterns? And protecting your fortresses should be the focus versus attribution, because the more energy you spend on attribution, the less energy you're spending on resilience, like Renee was talking about. So that's a shift which I'm seeing across the board.
Yeah, and I would stress, again, like Manoj says, attribution is very hard because, again, the proliferation of malware is being shared between the bad guys and so forth. But doing active cyber defense within your own networks, we call that a policy-friendly, target-rich environment because we all have the authorities to do things we want within our own networks. So I would encourage the private sector because, again, the model the government's trying to move toward is doing active cyber defense within our networks, going from sensing, sense-making, decision-making, and acting in cyber-relevant time. So we would encourage that model to be adopted for the private sector to do that within their own networks.
Yeah, I think once you go outside your network, though, you're setting a dangerous precedent. It becomes like the Wild West where everybody's shooting and there'll be a lot of collateral damage.
Next question. Gentleman in the back right there.
Terry Morgan from Global Thought, a small consultancy. Manoj, you made a comment about going into government business as a small firm. As the CEO of that firm, that meant you sat and made a resource decision commitment. You reallocated resources, strategically looked at it. What did the numbers, headcount, resources, risks, and IP that you considered, and how big an investment was it for you?
The last part of the question, what's the number of risks?
How big was the investment? Just to give us a framework. You decided that you were going to do this.
Right.
It's going to cost me X, and that's in a number of buckets.
Got it. So like I said, at the starting point of the company, the first commercial business we're going after, we would have never done this investment. So as we started growing rapidly, we have money coming in significantly, then we realized, okay, this is a great opportunity for us to expand into the government where there's a problem to be solved. So that's when we started making the investment. So the investment is in the order of about 5 to 10% of my total investment at this point of time. But even that investment, if I had started early, it would have been like 90% of my investment, and that wouldn't have been possible. So now it's about 10% about my investment.
Yes, sir.
Yes, Randall Fort with Raytheon. I'd like to go back to this active defense issue. I've been hearing this conversation now for a couple of years. Oh, Wild West. Yeah, it's a Wild West, only the rustlers are stealing everything, according to what government officials are telling us, tens of and hundreds and trillions of dollars of IP being stolen. The attribution thing, well, I got a Mandy report that gives me the actual address of the Chinese unit that is stealing my information. In my company, I actually have the screenshots of the Chinese that are stealing my information. So the attribution issue isn't necessarily a problem for everybody. The rustlers are stealing everything in your Wild West that you're talking about. The cavalry is not coming over the hill. The government is not taking action, except maybe in the Sony hack or something, because they threatened to blow up movie theaters. So we actually did see some reaction from the US government for a change, but not much. So, what are companies out there that have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on cybersecurity, that have the wit, that have the skill, that have hired the Mandians to know exactly where the perpetrators are? Why shouldn't they be able to do something about that?
So, it's tough for Pat. Go ahead, Marty.
Should we have a level of you must be this tall to get on this ride kind of bar for deciding who's authorized to go out and hack back? I've been working in this space for a long time, and I've seen a lot of security technology misapplied pretty brutally over the years. As the original author of Snort, I've seen my own stuff misapplied pretty tremendously as well. I think that the number of companies that are prepared to do that is a very small number of companies. I think the number of companies that have, so where do you stop? So you're a company, you figured out the bad guys who did it to you. Where do you stop? Do you stop just at disabling their computers when they can go to the next cyber cafe down the road? You have no legal recourse to go into their country and have them arrested. That's a job for the government to do. Do you hire hitmen to have them, kind of permanently taken off of your radar? I mean, where do you stop? Do you have the? I remember Dave Dietrich did a really interesting article on this a few years ago. The problem with having companies do it is that companies don't have any kind of moral, legal, ethical constraints on their behavior necessarily, apart from doing what is legal. And once you get outside the shores of the United States, where is that line? What can't you do? And I think that it's a dangerous bridge to cross because we are going into a space where traditionally governments have reigned, and yes, perhaps the United States government is not protecting your corporate interests very explicitly, but it feels really good to do something. But unless we have some sort of framework around what that something can be, where you can stop, what's to really stop it from turning into the Wild West, or having levels of escalation that nobody's prepared for. You hack back. Take them off the internet, they go down the road and decide they're going to take out the entire power grid that's powering the data center that is doing the hack back to their operations and so on and so forth. Because they certainly don't have any sort of proportionality associated with their operations as well. So I think there's some really big, hard questions about the ethics and legality that need to be answered before we start firing off return DDoSes and things like that, or taking actions which may be questionable in a lot of dimensions. So I think that's a big question. It's a bigger question than I have time for right now. But I think we need to really think hard about what we're willing to start if we're going to do those sorts of things.
It's definitely a government and a policy question. It's way beyond the panel. It's the elephant in the room because the reason why the Sony thing was a lot more easier to work and attribution and all that stuff was going on was because of the country involved was very different. The other country, the country starting with C, even though you clearly know what's happening there are much bigger things at stake. There is trade at stake. There is other things at stake at the much higher level, right? When they have access to the SCADA systems here, a particular hack on a commercial company is much less relevant compared to that, right? So there are bigger things at stake. One thing which was promising was the recent meeting between the two premiers in the US and China on cybersecurity and in terms of cyber war getting to an arms deal, right? That was the first time I've heard anything like that happen. Hopefully there will be more things in that happening in the future, just like arms deal in the physical arms race. In the cyber arms, there has to be a sort of a ceasefire. That is the only way this is going to change, to that level. This is well beyond the panel, in my opinion, the question.
Right, and that's one of the things the government has been working on is establishing what are those cyber norms for behavior in cyberspace. And again, this came out in the President Xi's visit. So again, that's one of the things that we need to be working on continuously within the government.
Well, I hate to say it, but we've run out of time. Thank you very much to the panelists for a great discussion, and thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you, Debbie.